Stop. You haven't subscribed to the channel yet. Subscribe now. We have new stories every day. Now, let's go. Jonathan Carver wiped the sweat from his brow as he rummaged through the dusty attic of his suburban Chicago home. At 38, the high school history teacher still possessed the energy to tackle weekend projects like cleaning out this long-neglected space. "Hey, what's this?" he muttered to himself, pulling out a worn leather album from behind a stack of old magazines. Settling onto an old trunk, Jonathan flipped open the cover. A wave of nostalgia washed over him as he leafed through photos of his Irish-American family. His eyes lingered on a recent family portrait. "Emma's grown so much," he mused, studying his 14-year-old daughter's features. Something nagged at the back of his mind. He turned to a picture of himself at the same age, comparing the two. The differences were subtle but undeniable. Emma's nose had a slight curve that he lacked. Her eyes, while blue like his, had an almond shape he couldn't place in his family tree. Jonathan flicked to a photo of 12-year-old Liam. The boy's complexion was a shade darker than his own, his hair a richer brown. "It's probably nothing," he told himself, trying to shake off the growing unease. But as he continued to study the photos, the seed of doubt took root. Later that evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Jonathan found himself hunched over his laptop in the dim light of his study. His fingers hesitated over the keyboard before he finally typed. "DNA test kits. What are you up to, hon?" Christina's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, a curious expression on her face. Jonathan quickly closed the laptop. "Oh, just looking up some stuff for class," he lied, feeling a pang of guilt. "Heading to bed soon." Christina nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Don't stay up too late. Good night, love." As she padded away, Jonathan reopened the laptop and placed an order for 3 DNA test kits. His heart raced as he hit confirm purchase, wondering what truth the results might reveal. Weeks passed. Each day was a torment as Jonathan waited for the DNA results. He found himself scrutinizing his children's features at the breakfast table, searching for any resemblance to himself or Christina. Finally, an email arrived. With trembling hands, Jonathan opened the attachment. His own results showed exactly what he expected, a mix of Irish and other European ancestry. But Emma and Liam's results made his blood run cold. Both showed a significant percentage of Mexican heritage. "This can't be right," he whispered, staring at the screen in disbelief. That night, after tossing and turning for hours, Jonathan made a decision. He'd hire a private investigator to get to the bottom of this mystery. The next day, he met with a PI named Frank in a nondescript coffee shop. "So what exactly are we looking for here?" Frank asked, his weathered face impassive. Jonathan leaned in, lowering his voice. "I need to know if my wife has been unfaithful, and if so, with whom." Frank nodded, jotting down notes. "Any suspicions about who it might be?" Jonathan shook his head. "No idea. But the kids, they might not be mine." 2 weeks later, Frank called with news. "Mr. Carver, I think you should come to my office. There's something you need to see." Jonathan's heart sank as he looked at the photos spread across Frank's desk. There was Christina, his wife of 15 years, in the arms of another man. A man with features that bore a striking resemblance to Emma and Liam. "His name is Miguel Ramirez," Frank explained. "He's Christina's boss at the construction company. They'd been seeing each other for at least 15 years, predating your marriage." Jonathan felt the room spin. 15 years. "But we've only been married for." Frank nodded. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carver. There's more." He pushed forward a stack of papers, love letters, emails, hotel receipts. The affair had been ongoing and quite passionate as Jonathan leafed through the evidence. His world crumbled around him. Every loving gesture, every family moment, all tainted by this monumental lie. "Who is he?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miguel Ramirez is a prominent figure in the local construction industry," Frank replied. He's known for his philanthropic work and his Mexican heritage. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Jonathan stared at a photo of Miguel, seeing echoes of Emma and Liam in the man's features. My whole life, it's been a lie. Jonathan murmured more to himself than to Frank. Reeling from the revelation, Jonathan knew he needed support. He decided to confide in his family, hoping for comfort and guidance. On a Sunday afternoon, he gathered his parents and siblings in the familiar warmth of his childhood home. The smell of his mother's apple pie, once comforting, now turned his stomach. I have something to tell you all, Jonathan began, his voice shaking. He recounted the discovery of the photos, the DNA tests, and finally the devastating results of the private investigation. As he spoke, he noticed an odd silence falling over the room. His mother wouldn't meet his eyes. His father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His sister, Sarah, exchanged a pointed look with their brother, Michael. What is it? Jonathan demanded, a new fear gripping his heart. What aren't you telling me? Sarah was the first to break. Johnny, we knew. The words hit him like a physical blow. You knew. What do you mean you knew? His father cleared his throat. Son, we found out about Christina's indiscretion a few years back. We thought it best not to tell you. Best not to tell me. Jonathan's voice rose in disbelief and anger battling for dominance. You let me live a lie. You let me raise children that aren't mine, thinking they were. His mother reached out a hand. We thought we were protecting you, dear. You seemed so happy. Jonathan recoiled from her touch. Happy? I was living in ignorance. How could you keep this from me? Michael spoke up, his tone defensive. We didn't want to hurt you, bro. We figured what you didn't know wouldn't hurt you. Wouldn't hurt me. Jonathan laughed bitterly. Look at me now. Tell me this doesn't hurt. He stood, unable to bear the sight of his family any longer. The people he trusted most in the world had betrayed him just as deeply as Christina had. Johnny, please, his mother pleaded. We can talk about this. We can help you through it. But Jonathan was already heading for the door. I don't need your help, he spat. I don't need any of you. As he stormed out into the fading afternoon light, Jonathan felt more alone than he ever had in his life. His wife, his children, even his own family. Everything he believed in had been built on lies. In that moment of crushing isolation, a cold resolve settled over him. He couldn't trust anyone he'd once held dear. The only person he could rely on now was himself. As he drove home, his mind racing with the enormity of the betrayals he'd uncovered, Jonathan made a decision. He would take matters into his own hands. He would have his revenge. The sun set on Jonathan Carver's old life, and with it, the last vestiges of the trusting, naive man he'd once been. In his place, Jonathan Carver hardened by betrayal, determined to reclaim control of his fate. Jonathan Carver sat in his classroom, staring at the empty desks before him. The weight of his recent discoveries pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. He'd barely slept in weeks, his mind constantly churning over the betrayals he'd uncovered. A knock at the door jarred him from his thoughts. Principal Simmons stood in the doorway, his face grim. Got a minute, John? He asked, though it wasn't really a question. Jonathan nodded, gesturing to an empty student desk. Simmons sat, the plastic chair creaking under his weight. There's no easy way to say this, Simmons began. But the school board's pushing through a new history curriculum. It's not good. Jonathan's brow furrowed. What do you mean, not good? Simmons sighed, pulling a folder from his briefcase. See for yourself. As Jonathan leafed through the documents, his frown deepened. The proposed changes were more than just not good. They were an outright whitewashing of historical events. This is unacceptable, Jonathan muttered, then looked up, remembering who he was talking to. Sorry, but Simmons was nodding. You're right. It is unacceptable. But the board's under pressure from some big donors. They're pushing this through whether we like it or not. Jonathan felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. It was the same fury that had been simmering since he discovered the truth about his family. "But this is something we can fight," he declared. "We can't let this happen," his voice low and determined. Simmons raised an eyebrow. John, I'm sympathetic, but my hands are tied." "Forget the board," Jonathan interrupted. "These kids deserve better. They deserve the truth." For a moment, Simmons looked like he might argue. Then his shoulders slumped. "You're right. But what can we do?" Jonathan stood, pacing the room. His mind, so recently clouded by personal turmoil, was suddenly crystal clear. "We organize teachers, parents, students. We make our voices heard." As he spoke, a plan began to form. It was more than just opposing the curriculum changes. It was a chance to channel all his pent-up anger and frustration into something productive, something that mattered. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan threw himself into the fight. He organized meetings, drafted petitions, and rallied support from every corner of the school community. One evening, as he was putting the finishing touches on a presentation for the next board meeting, Emma poked her head into his home office. "Dad," she said hesitantly, "can I talk to you?" Jonathan looked up, guilt washing over him. He'd been so focused on the curriculum battle, he'd barely spoken to his kids. "Of course, sweetheart. What's up?" Emma sat on the edge of his desk, her feet swinging nervously. "Is everything okay? You've been different lately." Jonathan's heart clenched. He wanted to tell her everything about her real father, about the lies, about the hurt. But looking at her concerned face, he couldn't bring himself to shatter her world. "I'm sorry, Em," he said softly. "There's just a lot going on at school. But I promise, everything's going to be okay." Emma nodded, not entirely convinced. "Is that why Mom's been crying at night?" The question hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. He'd been so wrapped up in his own pain and his crusade at school, he hadn't even noticed Christina's distress. I didn't know she was crying," he admitted. Emma shrugged. "She tries to hide it. But I hear her sometimes." Jonathan pulled his daughter into a hug, his mind racing. He'd been neglecting his family, losing himself in this external battle. "I'll talk to her," he promised Emma. "And I'm sorry I've been so distracted. How about we have a family game night tomorrow?" Emma's face lit up. "Really? Can we play Monopoly?" Jonathan laughed, the sound foreign to his own ears. "Sure, kiddo. Monopoly it is." As Emma bounced out of the room, Jonathan turned back to his computer. The fight against the curriculum changes was important, but so was his family. Even if that family wasn't what he'd always believed it to be, he had to find a balance, and he had to make a decision about what to do with the truth he now carried. As weeks passed, Jonathan found himself living a double life. By day, he was the passionate teacher, rallying support against the curriculum changes. By night, he was a man consumed by thoughts of revenge. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, he sat in his study, surrounded by financial records and legal documents. The private investigator, Frank, had come through with more than just evidence of the affair. He'd uncovered financial irregularities at Miguel's construction company, potential tax fraud that could bring the whole operation crashing down. Jonathan's fingers hovered over his keyboard. With just a few clicks, he could send an anonymous tip to the IRS. It would be the first domino in a chain reaction that could destroy Miguel's life. But was that what he really wanted? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Christina stood in the doorway, her face a mask of concern. "John, can we talk?" He nodded, quickly minimizing the windows on his computer screen. Christina perched on the edge of his desk, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "I'm worried about you," she said softly. "You've been so distant lately. Is it because of me?" Jonathan felt a surge of bitter laughter rise in his throat. If only she knew. "No," he lied, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "It's just this thing with the school board. It's taking up a lot of my time." Christina nodded, but her eyes told him she didn't quite believe him. "I miss you," she whispered, reaching out to touch his hand. For a moment, Jonathan almost gave in, almost told her everything he knew, everything he felt. But then he remembered the photos Frank had shown him, the love letters, 15 years of lies. He pulled his hand away. "I'm sorry," he said, not meeting her eyes. I need some time." Christina's face fell, but she nodded. As she left the room, Jonathan turned back to his computer. The next day, he met with a divorce attorney. The man was known for his aggressive tactics and high success rate. "So, Mr. Carver," the attorney said, leaning back in his plush leather chair, "what exactly are we dealing with here?" Jonathan laid out the whole sordid tale. The affair, the paternity of his children, his family's betrayal. The attorney's eyes gleamed with predatory interest. "Oh, this is good," he said, rubbing his hands together. "We're going to take her for everything she's got." But Jonathan shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "I don't want to hurt the kids. I just want justice." The attorney nodded, but Jonathan could see the disappointment in his eyes. "All right, we'll play it your way. But trust me, in cases like this, it's best to strike hard and fast." As Jonathan left the office, he felt a mix of relief and trepidation. The wheels were in motion now. There was no going back. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan methodically put his plan into action. He quietly liquidated joint assets, moving money into accounts only he could access. He gathered every scrap of evidence Frank had uncovered, building an ironclad case against Christina and Miguel. And then, one night when he was sure Christina was asleep, he made the call to the IRS. His voice shook as he detailed the tax fraud at Miguel's company, but he forced himself to see it through. As he hung up the phone, Jonathan felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him was exhilarated, finally taking action after weeks of helpless anger. But another part felt hollow, wondering if this path of revenge would really bring him the closure he sought. He pushed the doubts aside. He'd come too far to turn back now. The night of Miguel's company gala arrived. Jonathan found himself standing in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. Christina appeared behind him, resplendent in a shimmering evening gown. "You look handsome," she said, her eyes meeting his in the mirror. Jonathan forced a smile. "Thanks. You look beautiful." For a moment, he almost wavered. The woman in the mirror was the same one he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But then he remembered the lies, the betrayal, and his resolve hardened once more. The gala was held in an opulent ballroom, crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the crowd of Chicago's construction elite. Jonathan watched as Christina made her way through the room, laughing and chatting with ease. She was in her element here, the perfect corporate wife. And then he saw him, Miguel Ramirez, resplendent in a tailored tuxedo, holding court near the bar. Jonathan's fists clenched involuntarily at his sides. This was the man who had fathered his children and had been with his wife for 15 years. As the evening wore on, Jonathan bided his time. He made small talk, nursed a single glass of whiskey, and waited for his moment. Finally, Miguel took to the podium, his voice booming through the room, full of confidence and charm. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I'm thrilled to announce that this has been our most successful year yet. The future of Ramirez Construction has never looked brighter." The crowd burst into applause. Jonathan saw his chance. He stood, making his way towards the podium with purposeful strides. He could feel Christina's eyes on him, confusion and alarm evident on her face. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the applause. "I have something to add." Miguel's smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. "Of course, John. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan Carver, husband of our lovely HR director, Christina," took the microphone, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. "Thank you, Miguel," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I just wanted to congratulate you on your success. It's truly remarkable what you've built here." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. Christina was frozen in place, her face pale. But I think it's time we were all honest with each other, Jonathan continued. About the true foundation of this company's success. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a folder. I have here the results of DNA tests proving that Miguel Ramirez is the biological father of my children. I also have evidence of a 15-year affair between Mr. Ramirez and my wife, Cristina. The room erupted in gasps and whispers. Miguel's face went ashen, his knuckles white, as he gripped the podium. But that's not all, Jonathan pressed on, his voice rising above the din. I also have documents detailing years of tax fraud and embezzlement at Ramirez Construction. Documents that are currently in the hands of the IRS and the FBI. The room exploded into chaos. Board members were on their feet, shouting questions. Investors pushed towards the exits. In the center of it all stood Miguel and Cristina, their carefully constructed world crumbling around them. Jonathan watched as the company owner, his face purple with rage, stormed up to Miguel. "You're fired," he bellowed, "and you can bet your support will be cooperating fully with any investigation." Cristina stumbled towards Jonathan, tears streaming down her face. "John," she pleaded, "how could you do this?" Jonathan looked at her, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. "How could I?" he asked quietly. "How could you, Cristina? 15 years of lies. Our entire marriage. It was all a sham." As security began to clear the room, Jonathan turned and walked away. Behind him, he could hear Cristina's sobs and Miguel's attempts to placate the furious board members. But he didn't look back. Outside, the cool night air hit him like a slap to the face. He loosened his tie, taking deep breaths. It was done. His revenge was complete. But as he stood there, watching the chaos unfold through the ballroom's windows, Jonathan felt no joy. No sense of triumph. Just a hollow emptiness where his anger had once burned. He hailed a cab, giving the driver his home address. As the city lights blurred past, Jonathan wondered what came next. He had torn down the lie that was his life. Now he had to figure out how to build something true from the rubble. The morning after the gala, Jonathan Carver woke to a world forever changed. The taste of victory was bitter in his mouth, mixed with the acrid flavor of spent anger and lingering betrayal. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the hollowness in his chest would ever be filled again. His phone buzzed incessantly. News of last night's confrontation had spread like wildfire through Chicago's business and social circles. He ignored the calls and messages, focusing instead on the next step in his meticulously planned revenge. At precisely 9 a.m., Jonathan walked into the offices of Hartley and Associates, the law firm housing Chicago's most ruthless divorce attorney. Bernard Hartley's reputation preceded him, a shark in a sea of minnows, known for leaving opposing parties with little more than the clothes on their backs. Hartley's office was a testament to his success. Mahogany and leather, with a view of Lake Michigan that probably cost more per square foot than most people's entire homes. The lawyer himself was a study in contrasts. Expensive suit, neat haircut, and the hungry eyes of a predator. "Mr. Carver," Hartley said, rising to shake Jonathan's hand. "I heard about last night's performance. Quite the show, I must say." Jonathan nodded, taking the seat. "I want this done quickly and cleanly," he said. "Mr. Hartley, I have all the evidence you'll need right here." He placed a thick folder on the desk. Hartley's eyes gleamed as he leafed through the documents. "Oh, this is good. Very good indeed. With this, we can't." "No," Jonathan interrupted. "I don't want to destroy her completely. I just want what's fair. And I want the kids." Hartley's excitement dimmed slightly, but he nodded. "Of course, Mr. Carver, we'll proceed as you wish." Over the next few weeks, Jonathan's life became a whirlwind of legal meetings and court appearances. Cristina, backed into a corner by the mountain of evidence against her, hardly put up a fight. Her once immaculate appearance had given way to dark circles under her eyes and a permanent look of defeat. In the end, the judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Jonathan was awarded full custody of Emma and Liam, along with the majority of their assets. Christina was left with a small alimony payment and visitation rights that felt more like a consolation prize than a victory. As Jonathan left the courthouse, he caught sight of Christina slumped on a bench, her head in her hands. For a moment, he felt a twinge of something: pity, regret. But then he remembered the years of lies, the betrayal that had hollowed out his life, and he walked on without a backward glance. Meanwhile, across town, Miguel Ramirez was facing his own personal hell. The IRS investigation, triggered by Jonathan's anonymous tip, had uncovered years of tax fraud and embezzlement. Miguel's once stirring reputation in the construction industry was in tatters. Desperate to recoup his losses and maintain his lavish lifestyle, Miguel turned to the only avenue he thought might save him: gambling. He started small, placing bets at legitimate casinos. But as his losses mounted and his desperation grew, he found himself drawn into the seedy underbelly of Chicago's illegal gambling scene. One night, in a smoke-filled backroom of a rundown bar, Miguel sat at a poker table, sweat beading on his brow. He was down to his last chip, having already lost his savings, his home, and any chance of rebuilding his reputation in the industry. "All in," he rasped, pushing the last chip forward. The dealer, a man with dead eyes and nicotine-stained fingers, dealt the final card. Miguel's hand shook as he turned over his cards. "House wins," the dealer intoned, his voice devoid of emotion. Miguel stumbled from the table, his world spinning. He'd lost everything. In a matter of months, he'd gone from being one of Chicago's most respected businessmen to a penniless gambler with a mountain of debt. As he stumbled out into the cold Chicago night, Miguel Ramirez realized that his carefully constructed life, built on lies and deceit, had crumbled to dust. And somewhere across the city, Jonathan Carver slept soundly for the first time in months, his revenge complete. The foreclosure signs stood stark against the manicured lawn of the Carver family home. Jonathan watched from the driveway as the realtor hammered them into place. "Dad." Emma's voice pulled him from his reverie. "Are we really leaving?" Jonathan turned to his daughter, seeing the mix of uncertainty and hope in her eyes. At 14, Emma was old enough to understand the broad strokes of what had happened, if not all the sordid details. "Yeah, sweetheart, we are," he said, pulling her into a hug. "It's time for a fresh start." Liam bounded out of the house, his 12-year-old energy seemingly undiminished by the turmoil of the past months. "I call shotgun on the moving truck," he yelled, racing past them towards the driveway. Jonathan couldn't help but smile, despite everything. The lies, the betrayal, the public spectacle of the divorce. His kids had shown a resilience that continually amazed him. They'd chosen to stay with him, recognizing his unwavering love and support even in the face of the shocking revelation about their biological father. The move to a new town was more than just a change of scenery. It was a chance to rebuild, to create a life unburdened by the weight of past deceptions. Jonathan had accepted a position as principal at Oak Ridge Academy, a prestigious private school known for its progressive approach to teaching history. As they pulled out of the driveway for the last time, Jonathan caught a glimpse of his neighbors peering out from behind their curtains. No doubt they were glad to see the back of the Carvers, tired of the whispers and scandal that had plagued the once quiet suburban street. The drive to their new home was filled with a mix of excited chatter from the kids and long stretches of contemplative silence. Jonathan's mind wandered to the curriculum debate that had consumed him in the midst of his personal turmoil. His victory in that fight had earned him widespread respect in educational circles, opening doors he never thought possible. As they crossed the state line, leaving the familiar skyline of Chicago behind, Jonathan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The anger that had fueled him for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious optimism for the future. Their new home was smaller than the old one, but brighter somehow. Large windows let in streams of sunlight, illuminating rooms that seemed to hold the promise of new beginnings. As Emma and Liam raced through the house, clanging bedrooms and arguing over closet space, Jonathan stood in the empty living room, taking it all in. The first few weeks in their new town were a whirlwind of unpacking, school preparations, and community introductions. Jonathan threw himself into his new role at Oak Ridge Academy, determined to make a positive impact on his students' lives. It was during this time that Jonathan realized he needed to do more than just move on. He needed to heal. The betrayal he'd experienced had left deep scars, ones that wouldn't fade without conscious effort. On a whim, he decided to start a support group for people who had been betrayed by their spouses. The first meeting was held in a small room at the local community center, with just 3 attendees besides himself. "My name is John," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "And I'm here because my wife of 15 years had an affair with her boss. An affair that resulted in the 2 children I thought were mine." As he spoke, Jonathan felt a weight lifting from his chest. The simple act of sharing his story, of speaking his truth to others who understood, was cathartic in a way he hadn't anticipated. Week by week, the group grew. People from all walks of life, united by the common thread of betrayal, found solace and strengthened each other's stories. Jonathan discovered a sense of purpose in helping others navigate the turbulent waters of broken trust and shattered relationships. It was at one of these meetings that Jonathan first met Alexandra. She sat quietly at the back of the room, her dark hair framing a face that spoke of both strength and vulnerability. When she finally spoke, her story of betrayal and resilience resonated deeply with Jonathan. After the meeting, they found themselves lingering, conversation flowing easily between them. Alexandra, it turned out, was also an educator, a history teacher at a nearby high school. "I've heard great things about what you're doing at Oak Ridge," she said, a spark of admiration in her eyes. "Your approach to teaching history is inspiring." Jonathan felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. "It's been a challenge, but a rewarding one." As the weeks turned to months, Jonathan and Alexandra's friendship deepened. They challenged each other intellectually, sharing ideas about education and life. She inspired him to push boundaries, to think beyond conventional teaching methods. One evening, as they walked through a local park after a particularly intense discussion about the role of education and social justice, Jonathan realized something had changed. The hollow feeling in his chest, the one he'd carried for so long, had been filled with something new, something hopeful. He turned to Alexandra, seeing the same realization mirrored in her eyes. Slowly, cautiously, they leaned towards each other. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a promise of something genuine and honest. As they pulled apart, Jonathan felt a mix of excitement and fear. "I'm not sure I'm ready for this," he admitted. Alexandra squeezed his hand. "That's okay," she said softly. "We've got time." And for the first time in years, Jonathan Carver looked to the future with genuine hope. 5 years passed in a blur of school events, family dinners, and quiet evenings with Alexandra. Jonathan's life had settled into a rhythm he never thought possible in the aftermath of his divorce. Emma, now 19, was thriving in her first year of college. Liam, 17, was captain of his high school debate team. His quick wit and passion for justice were a constant source of pride for Jonathan. It was a crisp autumn morning when the call came. Jonathan was in his office at Oak Ridge Academy, reviewing applications for a new history teacher position when his phone buzzed. The number wasn't one he recognized, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello, John. It's Rebecca," Christina's sister said. Jonathan felt his stomach drop. He hadn't heard from anyone in Christina's family since the divorce. "Rebecca, what's wrong?" There was a pause, filled with the static of unsaid words. "It's Christina. She's gone, John. She passed away last night." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jonathan gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. "What happened?" It was her heart. Rebecca's voice cracked. She went in her sleep." As Rebecca continued to speak, filling in the details of funeral arrangements and legal matters, Jonathan found himself oddly detached. He felt no joy in Christina's death, but neither did he feel the crushing sorrow he might have expected. It was as if he was hearing about the passing of a distant acquaintance, not the woman he'd once vowed to love for a lifetime. But it was Rebecca's next words that truly shocked him. "John, there's something else you should know," she said, her voice heavy with a mix of guilt and sadness. "Christina, she's been struggling these past few years. After the divorce, after everything that happened with Miguel, she couldn't find work in her field. The scandal, you know." Jonathan listened in stunned silence as Rebecca painted a picture of Christina's final years. Unable to secure a job in human resources or any corporate setting, she'd been reduced to working as a janitor at a local community college. She'd been living in a small, run-down apartment, barely making ends meet. And Miguel? Jonathan found himself asking, though he wasn't sure why he cared. Rebecca's bitter laugh crackled through the phone. "That man fled to Mexico about a year ago. Gambling debts, from what I heard. Left Christina to fend for herself." As the call ended, Jonathan sat in his office, the silence pressing in around him. The life he built over the past 5 years suddenly felt fragile, as if the ghosts of his past could reach out and shatter it at any moment. That evening, he gathered Emma and Liam in the living room. Alexandra sat nearby, a silent pillar of support. "Kids," Jonathan began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "I have some news about your mother." He watched their faces carefully as he relayed the information, ready to offer comfort or explanations as needed. But his children, now young adults, received the news with a maturity that both surprised and saddened him. "Do you think we should go to the funeral?" Emma asked, her voice small. Jonathan looked at his daughter, seeing echoes of Christina in her features. "I think that's something we need to decide together," he said gently. "It's okay if you want to go. It's also okay if you don't." After a long discussion, filled with tears and moments of quiet reflection, they decided as a family to attend the funeral, not out of obligation, Jonathan realized, but as an act of closure, a final chapter in a story that had shaped all their lives. The day of the funeral dawned gray and cool. Jonathan stood between Emma and Liam at the graveside, their hands clasped tightly in his. As the priest intoned the final prayers, Jonathan found his mind wandering, reflecting on the twisted path that had led him to this moment. His revenge had brought a kind of justice, yes, but standing here, watching his children say goodbye to a mother they barely knew, he realized it hadn't brought him happiness. That had come later, through his resilience, his focus on his children, and his dedication to his principles. As they turned to leave the cemetery, Jonathan squeezed his children's hands. He looked at them, really looked at them, and felt a surge of gratitude for the authentic life they now shared, a life free from lies and betrayal, built on a foundation of honesty and unconditional love. They walked towards the parking lot where Alexandra waited by the car. Her presence was a reminder of the new chapter in their lives, one built on trust, integrity, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. As they drove away from the cemetery, leaving behind the last physical tie to their old life, Jonathan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead was uncertain, but he was no longer afraid of the journey. He had his children, he had Alexandra, and he had a life built on truth. The ghosts of the past would always be there, lingering in the shadows of memory, but they no longer held power over him. Jonathan Carver had faced his demons, weathered the storm of betrayal, and emerged stronger on the other side. As the car turned onto the highway, heading home, Jonathan looked in the rearview mirror at Emma and Liam. They were engrossed in quiet conversation, their heads bent together. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that despite all the pain and heartache, he wouldn't change a thing. For it was through those trials that they have forged this new family, one bound not by blood or false promises, but by choice, by love, and by an unwavering commitment to honesty. The future stretched out before them, a blank canvas waiting to be painted with new memories, new triumphs, and new love. And for the first time in a very long time, Jonathan Carver was truly, deeply happy. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.